The stagecoach hadn't even rolled to a full stop when the door flew open and a woman jumped down before the driver could offer his hand, boots hitting the dust of Prairie Bend, Montana territory in the autumn of 1887. She had a rifle slung over one shoulder, trail dust caked into the hem of a plain brown traveling dress that had clearly been let out at the seams more than once, and eyes the color of a storm about to break. Waiting for her on the platform, holding a bouquet of wilting prairie roses and wearing his one good coat, stood Thomas Hargrove, the largest rancher in 3 counties, a man who had written 4 letters and paid for 1 ticket, expecting to meet a soft-spoken school teacher named Eleanor Whitfield. What he got instead was this. She looked him dead in the eye, glanced down at the little photograph he was holding, a photograph of a delicate young woman with ringlets and a lace collar, and said the words that would follow him the rest of his life. "You bought the wrong bride." Thomas Hargrove did not flinch. He did not call for the sheriff, and he did not demand his money back from the marriage broker who'd arranged the whole affair through the mail. He simply lowered the flowers, looked at this stranger standing in his dead intended's place, and smiled. Then he held out his hand and said, "Well then, I suppose we'd better find out who you are." Her name was Josephine Carter, and she had not set out to steal anyone's life. 3 weeks earlier, in a boarding house in Cheyenne, she had watched Eleanor Whitfield, her employer's niece and the woman she had been hired to chaperone west, collapse from a fever that the local doctor could not name and could not cure. Eleanor died in the night with Josephine holding her hand, and in the gray hours before dawn, with a funeral to arrange and no money to arrange it with, Josephine had made a decision that still turned her stomach when she thought about it too long. She took Eleanor's ticket. She took the letters from the rancher in Montana, who had never seen either woman's face, except in a photograph taken years earlier of a cousin who looked nothing like Josephine at all. And she rode west, under a dead woman's name, because the alternative was starving in a city that had already taken everything else from her. Thomas listened to all of this standing in his own barn that evening, the lantern light throwing long shadows across the hay, while his foreman pretended very hard to be occupied with a bridle across the yard. He was 34 years old, widowed once already by a wife who had died of pneumonia 2 winters back, and he had written to the marriage broker not out of loneliness exactly, but out of practicality. A ranch this size needed a partner who could run a household, keep books, and survive a Montana winter, and courting in the traditional sense required a social life he simply did not have time for. He had expected a stranger. He had not expected a liar. And yet, listening to Josephine Carter's voice shake as she told him the truth, instead of continuing the lie, he found himself doing something he hadn't expected either. He believed her. "I could have kept pretending," she said, arms crossed tight against the cold. "I could have married you as Eleanor and let you find out in a year, or never. I chose to tell you the moment I stepped off that coach, because you deserved the truth before you decided anything, even if the truth costs me the ticket home." Thomas turned that over in his mind, the way he turned over a horse before buying it, looking for the tell that meant trouble. He didn't find one. What he found instead was a woman who had made a desperate choice and then refused to let the lie grow any bigger than it already was. There is a lesson worth sitting with here, one that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with character. It is easy to judge people by the moment they arrive in our lives, by the dust on their boots or the mistake in their past. It is much harder and much more valuable to judge them by what they do the instant they are given a chance to keep lying and choose honesty instead. That single choice, made in a cold barn with everything to lose, is what separated Josephine Carter from a con artist, and it is what made Thomas Hargrove decide to give her a job as his housekeeper instead of a ticket back to Wyoming. That was the arrangement they settled on that first night, practical as a fence line. She would stay through the winter, earn honest wages, help him catch up on the household ledgers that had gone untouched since his first wife passed. And in the spring, once she had enough saved, she could go wherever she pleased. There would be no marriage, no pretending, nothing but a fair wage for fair work. It should have been simple. It was not. because Josephine Carter turned out to be nothing like the school teacher in the photograph, and nothing like what Thomas expected a housekeeper to be either. She could not embroider, but she could read a brand off a running steer at 200 yards. She burned the first 3 suppers she attempted, but she could splint a broken leg on a calf better than the local veterinarian, a skill she'd learned working cattle drives out of Texas before her family's ranch went under in the drought of 1884, and scattered her kin across 4 states looking for work. She had grown up on horseback, not in a parlor, and the longer she stayed at the Hargrove ranch, the more Thomas realized that the woman standing in front of him was worth 10 of the delicate photograph he'd been sent. This is where the story earns its educational weight, because the reality of homesteading in the 1880s had almost nothing to do with lace collars and everything to do with survival. Ranching families needed partners who understood livestock, weather, and the brutal arithmetic of a herd that had to survive a winter on stored hay and luck. Mail-order marriages, common across the frontier during this period, were often less about romance and more about the practical need for labor, companionship, and a second set of capable hands on land, where the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles off. Josephine, without meaning to, was exactly the kind of partner the frontier actually demanded, even if she was not the bride Thomas thought he was ordering. Winter came hard that year, the way it does in Montana, snow stacking against the barn doors, and cattle needing to be pushed down from the high pasture before the passes closed. It was during one of these drives, 3 months into her stay, that Josephine noticed something wrong in Thomas's ledgers, something she hadn't been looking for and almost wished she hadn't found. A man named Everett Coyle, Thomas's late father's business partner and the executor who had helped settle the estate when Thomas's father died 5 years earlier, had been quietly filing water rights claims on a stretch of the northern range that Thomas had always assumed belonged to the ranch outright. Josephine, who had spent 2 years keeping books for a mercantile before her family's own ranch collapsed, recognized the pattern immediately. Small transfers, filing fees paid from the estate account, a signature on a water rights deed that looked like Thomas's father's hand but wasn't quite. She brought it to Thomas at the kitchen table one night, laying the papers out the way she'd have laid out a hand of cards, and watched his jaw tighten as he understood what she was showing him. If Coyle's claim held, he would control the only reliable water source on the northern range come summer, and a rancher who doesn't control his water doesn't really control his land at all, no matter whose name is on the deed. This is the piece of frontier law that many people watching today might not know, but it shaped the entire American West. Water rights, under what was known as prior appropriation doctrine, often mattered more than land ownership itself, because in dry country, whoever controlled the water controlled everything downstream of it, literally and legally. A man could own 1,000 acres and still be at the mercy of whoever held the rights to the creek running through it. Thomas wanted to ride into town and confront Coyle directly, but Josephine talked him out of it, and this is where her particular skills, forged by hardship rather than schooling, proved their worth. Confronting a man with an accusation and no proof only gives him time to cover his tracks, she told him. What you need is the original filing, the one made before your father died, because if Coyle altered a claim after the fact, the county clerk's office will have a record of the amendment date, and amendments leave a paper trail even forged signatures can't erase. It took 3 weeks of careful, quiet work, Josephine riding into the county seat under the pretense of ordering supplies, cross-referencing filing dates with a clerk who owed her no favors and had no reason to lie, and slowly building a case that showed Coyle had filed the amended water rights claim 4 months after Thomas's father's death, not before it, using a signature copied from an old business letter. When they finally laid the evidence in front of the Territorial Land Office that spring, Coyle did not go quietly, but the paper trail did not care whether he went quietly or not. Documents don't feel guilt, and they don't need convincing, Josephine told Thomas as they rode home from the hearing. They just need to be found. The claim was voided, the water rights restored to the ranch, and Everett Coyle, who had spent 5 years slowly bleeding a grieving young man's inheritance for his own gain, found himself facing charges of fraud and forgery in a territory that did not treat land theft lightly, given how much a man's entire livelihood depended on secure title to what he owned. It would be easy to end the story there, with justice served and a villain exposed, but the real ending was quieter than that, and truer to how life actually works. Thomas did not fall in love with Josephine because she saved his ranch. He had already begun to feel something for her months before, in the ordinary moments that never make it into photographs. Watching her patch a fence in the sleet without complaint, watching her sit up 3 nights straight nursing a sick horse back to health, watching her tell him the truth again and again, in small ways even when a lie would have been easier. The water rights case only confirmed something he already suspected, which was that the woman standing in his kitchen was more capable, more honest, and more essential to the life he wanted to build than any photograph could have shown him. He asked her properly in early summer, not with a letter through a broker, but standing in the same barn where she had first confessed her lie, holding out the same hand he'd offered on the day she arrived. "I bought a bride I never met," he told her, "and what I got instead was a partner I could never have ordered by mail if I'd tried, because nobody would have known to describe you to me. I'm not asking you to be Eleanor Whitfield. I'm asking Josephine Carter, the real woman who told me the truth when the lie would have been easier, to stay for good." She said yes, and this time there was no photograph standing between them, no name that wasn't hers, nothing but 2 people who had built trust the hard way, through honesty under pressure rather than romance under false pretenses. The moral of this story is not simply that honesty is rewarded, though it certainly was here. It is that character reveals itself most clearly in the moments we are least prepared for, the moments when lying would be easy, and the truth costs us something real. Josephine could have kept the lie going. She chose not to, and that single choice, made in a cold barn with nothing to gain and everything to lose, became the foundation for everything good that followed. It is also a story about looking past the surface of what we expect, whether that is a photograph that doesn't match the person, or an inheritance that looks secure until someone takes the time to actually check the paperwork behind it. The West rewarded people who paid attention to details others overlooked, whether that was a brand on a steer, a filing date on a legal document, or the true character of a stranger standing in the dust where someone else was supposed to be. Thomas Hargrove did not get the bride he ordered. He got something the marriage broker could never have promised him in a letter, a woman whose worth had nothing to do with a photograph and everything to do with what she did when no one would have blamed her for doing otherwise. And in the end, that turned out to be exactly the bride and exactly the partner he needed all along.